Chapter 8. The Sting of the Yellow Jackets. Oh, they call me Hangin' Johnny. Hooray, boys, hooray. And they say I hang for money. So hang, boys, hang. Halyard Shanty. Keep that shiver in the mizzen royal, said Old Smith, as Bert laid his hands on the spokes of the polished 6-foot wheel. The course is by the wind. She's steering west-southwest, a half south, but bring her up a half point when you can. Bert craned his neck to gaze upward through the skylight in the roof of the wheelhouse at the quivering royal. That was the steering sail when the bark was by the wind, and it was his job to keep it shivering, neither full and drawing like the lower sails, nor entirely empty of wind. His job. Why, for 1 hour, the boy reflected, the huge bark was practically in his hands. Of course, there was his mate, Charlie Hansen, striding up and down the poop in company with Sparks, the wireless operator, and in the chart house only a few feet away sat the captain. But still, the actual steering of the bark was up to him. The 1 hour trick passed quickly. Several times the third mate stepped into the wheelhouse to inspect the compass, and once Captain Hagerstrom himself looked in. The doctor's black beard poked inside the door once also, and Bert had the uncomfortable feeling that he was being subjected to a close scrutiny. Too soon, the wheelhouse clock pointed to 10 o'clock. Bert reluctantly struck 4 bells. A brawny Scandinavian relieved him, and he made his way back to the main deck. The 2 days at sea had worked a seeming transformation in the China gang. Groups of Negroes squatted on the deck, pleading with rolling dice to provide new shoes for the baby. Guitars and mandolins twanged accompaniments to soft Spanish love songs. Some 50 Chinese, Bert discovered, were quartered in the forward 'tween decks, but whether they were contented or discontented he could not have said. They appeared on deck, but seldom, preferring to spend their time below decks, gambling with quiet intensity or lying dreamily in their bunks, smoking their long-stemmed pipes. Never for a moment did they deign to associate with the Negroes or Mexicans or the few white members of the China gang. The tween-decker's general air of cheerfulness almost convinced Bert that Officer Murphy had been right in saying that the gang would forget its troubles when the vessel got to sea. Still, as he walked forward over the plank-covered piles, he noticed a few members of the China gang standing apart from the others, a young Negro with fear in his eyes, a white lad whose face was drawn with terror. Bert saw and wondered. Fear of what? Terror of what? What was going on down there between decks? What was in the minds of this restless human cargo? Acting on a sudden impulse, Bert turned aft again before he reached the midship deckhouse, where the other men of his watch paced up and down, walked to the after deckhouse, and dropped down the steps into the gloom and foul air of the after 'tween decks. He would see what this inner world of the bark was like. His first impulse was to scurry back up the stairs into the fresh air and sunshine, but he held himself there at the foot of the stairs until his eyes became somewhat accustomed to the gloom. At a narrow board table nearby sat 8 or 10 men intent over a poker game. Several of the faces were familiar to the boy. There was the big Negro who had handed him the wind-blown note from Pete Condon's pocket. Beside him sat a slender Negro. Could it be the same man who had tried to escape from the bark by swimming, and whom Officer Pat Murphy had escorted back aboard? Then there was a round-faced Mexican boy, and, Bert started at the sight of him, the second mate, whose passion for the game had won him the name of Poker Gust. Next to the second sat Pete Condon. Across the table, between a Mexican and Dopey J, sat Dr. Heiss. A slovenly, unshaven, white tween-decker completed the group. Not the flicker of an eyelid indicated that any one of the players had noticed Bert's arrival. Silent and wide-eyed, he watched them. Was poker the great leveler that brought this strange group together? Could mere love of the game wipe out the distinctions between the 3 classes of men represented by the players? For the sailors would not ordinarily be seen so much as talking with members of the China gang, and the social line between sailors and the ship's officers was age-old. The ship's doctor was a superior sort of creature, who was privileged to associate with the officers, and even the captain. And yet here was the Queen of Asia's doctor gambling with both crew and 'tween-decks gang. If poker was as democratic as that, Bert reflected, then the makers of the Constitution should have designated poker as the national game. But might there not be something else to account for this strange mixture? 3 of them were already connected by definite links. But where did the second mate come in, and the other tween-deckers? Fearful lest he attract attention by his prolonged stare, Bert sauntered off toward the rows of triple-decked wooden bunks that ran forward and aft until the narrow passages between faded into the murk. Partly to get out of sight of the poker players, and partly from curiosity as to what lay beyond, Bert slipped into a passage and felt his way along the sawdust-covered floor. A few lighted candles stuck on the edges of bunks shed feeble rays into the gloom and on the black and brown faces behind them. Once, something was muttered in Spanish as he passed. A low voice said, "White boy, you better get out of here fast, or you'll sure be carried out." Nearly every man he passed was smoking a cigarette, Bert noticed, and their smoke made him dizzy. It was not the odor of tobacco. Could these be the strange cigarettes that Beth had discovered in the coffee can on Pier 50? A limp hand touched him, clung for a moment to his shirt, while a drunken voice pleaded, "Want another cigarette? Tell Dopey J. Please, mister. Gotta have another cigarette. Here's 50 cents. Pay for it." Bert kept on, hoping for another way out at the end of the passage, but now he crashed heavily into a steel bulkhead. He must go back the way he had come. It all seemed like a nightmare, and his brain whirled from the queer smoke. He turned to start back. The passage seemed much lighter now, since he was facing the comparatively bright light around the foot of the stairs. He stepped forward quickly, eager to be out of the loathsome place, then stopped suddenly as he saw that 2 men effectually blocked his way out. Was their presence accidental, or had they deliberately closed the door to the trap? If it were a trap, Bert bent forward to see if it were possible to crawl over 2 adjoining bunks and into the next passage. The way was clear. On the verge of throwing himself into the bunk at his side, he straightened quickly at a sudden movement in the highest bunk behind him. Instinctively, he threw his arm over his face to ward off the blow which he felt was coming. He was conscious of a sharp pain in his forearm as it was knocked down by a heavy object. Then the world went black. How long he lay unconscious, Bert had no way of knowing, but the next thing that his sense registered was the soft, low voice of a Negro. "White boy, is you goin' wake up, or is you dead?" Bert felt a large hand on his chest, shaking him gently. Was he asleep or dead? What a silly question. No, wait. Which was he? He tried to lift a hand to his throbbing head. In his hands, his arms, his whole body, there was a dull ache. With a tremendous effort, he opened his eyes and saw nothing. He strained his muscles in an effort to move. "You can't move, white boy. Lie still." Bert felt the speaker's warm breath on the side of his face. The man's voice was little more than a whisper. "What happened? Who are you?" Bert demanded. There was a soft chuckle. "What happened is that you went to sleep as the consequence of a severe contact on the cranial, and yo ain't batted an eye for 5 hours. Who am I is another question. My name is Henry James Johnson, but mostly dey just calls me Big Boy. I's the colored man that give you that piece of paper with the funny writing on it." A knock on the head, out for 5 hours, no wonder his head ached. And judging from the foul air, the darkness, and the presence of the big Negro, he must be in a bunk in the tween-decks quarters. Would the Negro help him? He seemed friendly enough. "How long am I to be kept here?" Bert asked. "Till after dark. And then?" "And then, white boy, you was arranged to go for a swim with a piece of iron on your feet." Bert shuddered. "But you're going to let me go, aren't you?" he asked. Again came the soft chuckle. "Let you go? No, sir. White boy, I ain't going to let yo go. But if you happen to get away when I wasn't looking." While he spoke, his hands worked quietly on the ropes that held the boy's arms tightly on his sides. In a moment, Bert was chafing his numb arms to restore the circulation. After a few seconds of silence, the Negro went on. "Has yo' got a good disrememberer, white boy?" he asked. "Sure," Bert answered. "What do you want me to forget?" "If yo' could for surely disremember who told you, I could tip you off that a mutation is going to take place on this ship." "A what?" Bert queried. "A mutation. Dey has already picked a new cap'n, and in a few days, dey is going to mutate." "A mutiny?" Bert breathed. "Who's going to mutiny, big boy? The Tweendecks gang?" But he did not need the Negro's whispered, "Yessuh, that's who," to tell him that his guess was right. A mutiny of the China gang. Diseased and weak as they were individually, they yet outnumbered the crew 5-1. He must escape now, for not only his own life but the lives of officers and crew might depend on his getting word to the captain, and such a mutiny, if successful, would spell the end of the Nushagak Salmon Company, for its continued existence depended on a good pack this season in the Nushagak River Cannery. The Negro moved restlessly. "I ain't looking now, white boy," he said. Bert murmured his thanks and swung his legs gingerly to the floor. Was there a single muscle in his body that did not ache? He stood up and stretched luxuriously, wondering that a blow on his head could have knocked him out for 5 hours without crushing his skull. Could he have been drugged? "When you go fast," Big Boy Johnson advised. "And if you see a scrawny piece of white trash in your way, sock him." "That'll be Dopey J," Bert thought, "and sock him I will with great pleasure." With one arm held straight before him, he raced down the passage and burst into the open space at the foot of the stairs where the poker game or another was still in progress. Without wasting a glance at the poker players, he rushed for the stairs, focusing his attention on the line of escape and the figure of Dopey J that rose up, startled, in front of him. Summoning all of his strength in his aching body, the boy struck out. He felt a thrill of satisfaction as his fist crashed against the hophead's jaw and crumpled him up on the sawdust-covered deck. Then he sprang for the stairs.